So it's difficult to say how many Afghans are in Russia exactly. Many citizens of Afghanistan found themselves refugees sur place or in place when the Najibullah regime fell, and this made returning to their homes impossible. According to UNHCR, there are approximately 150,000 Afghans in Russia at this time. But then in 2004, the Federal Migration Service of Russia put the number at 80 to 100,000. Amongst them, there are some 2,000 Afghan orphans who were brought to the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. Unfortunately, there are few solutions for Afghan refugees arriving in Russia today. Many use Russia as a starting point for their journey to other European countries. One of the major issues facing Afghan refugees in Russia is that they can get no official status, and it's very difficult to live in Russia without registration at your place of abode that was called propiska in Soviet times. Their status would be regularised if they were granted refugee status, but there are severe difficulties for people trying to apply for asylum in Russia. Practically no one was granted refugee status in Russia in 2011. Refugees complain that there is no access to submit asylum applications. They're insulted by staff from the Federal Migration Service. They're not given the correct documents. There's corruption. They receive a standard rejection with no individual examination of their case, or they're actually arrested while they're applying for asylum in order to be deported. Refugees, including Afghans, have to submit repeat applications and appeals to the court, and courts often just rubber stamp the decision of the Federal Migration Service without any looking at the case in detail. NGOs in Russia are forced to apply for emergency measures from the European Court of Human Rights to stop refugees being deported back to Afghanistan or other countries where they could face torture. The few Afghans who do receive status are granted temporary asylum, a type of subsidiary or humanitarian protection that needs to be renewed yearly, and this rarely happens. Ayatollah Mohammed Tahir was one of the orphans brought to Russia as an adolescent in 1986. He married a Russian citizen, had 2 children, bought a house in a village, but was unable to legalise his presence in Russia for over 20 years. He was recently granted refugee status on his 3rd application. Without registration or official status, it's very difficult for people to access even basic services such as medical care, schools, finding work. People are also in danger of being stopped by the police for a document check and being returned back to Afghanistan where their lives could be in danger. Civic Assistance is a sister organisation of Memorial Human Rights Organisation. They give social and other assistance to refugees, and they helped about 1,600 Afghan refugees last year, which is about 55% of their caseload. There's no official breakdown between male and female applicants in the statistics, but Civic Assistance says about 20% more of their clients are men than women. Although more men than women approach them for assistance, they have equal access to services, with women and children and pregnant women being given assistance without having to wait, and also being prioritised for humanitarian and medical assistance. The situation for medical care for refugees became worse at the end of 2010, when the Department of Health in Moscow stopped offering free medical care to migrants. Before this date, children and pregnant women were able to receive care at their local polyclinic, and anyone with a really serious illness could visit a hospital. However, this is no longer the case, and thousands of people are now literally dependent on whatever limited support that can be offered by UNHCR or local NGOs. Resettlement to a 3rd country, such as the United States or Canada, is often the only real solution for refugees from Afghanistan in Russia. However, the number of places are very low, and in reality, only a handful of people each year get this opportunity. There are some programs of assistance by NGOs. Civic Assistance runs schools for refugee children and evening classes for adults. UNHCR doesn't run any specific program for Afghan women or refugees generally, outside of their programs for legal social assistance that all refugees are entitled to. There was an NGO that previously ran programs for Afghan women and children, Equilibra Solidarność, but unfortunately it closed down due to lack of funding in 2010. There are several Afghan community groups based around a hotel in the centre of Moscow who help with finding employment and humanitarian emergency assistance for refugees. We have a really short case study at this point that someone volunteered to read. I'm looking for Irena, if you want to come. It's just a short thing with some positive example of an Afghan woman who settled in Russia.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me properly. My name is Irena Benedict, and I'm a voluntary teacher in the Afghanistan and Central Asian Organization. And today I'd like to share with you a story about a refugee. Fatma arrived in Russia from Afghanistan with her family in 1989 when she was only 2 years old. The family arrived to join their father, who was studying in the military academy in the Soviet Union. Shortly afterwards the war began, they stayed in Russia as third-placed refugees. When the family's visa expired after 2 years, they encountered many problems. Without documents, they found it hard to work, to study, to attend nursery school. They applied to the UNHCR and got some temporary documentation. Later they applied to the migration services and eventually got temporary asylum. Education. In order to get a place at school in the early 1990s, Fatma explains, we had to do so not through our documents but through relatives or by paying. My father went to the school and sorted it out with them somehow. Feeling settled. Fatma studied and then went to medical college and is now working for UNHCR as a nurse and also as a translator for an NGO and for the migration services. She feels settled in Russia, has lived there for 19 years, knows the language well and has many friends. I hope you can start hearing me properly. I feel it is my country as if I am not from Afghanistan. Sometimes I feel like that. I feel like a Muscovite. And as if I was born here. Of course I am proud of being Afghani, but as I grew up in Moscow, it feels far away. I don't know if I could have got such an education in another country. I feel good. Moscow gave me a lot, very much indeed. In Afghanistan, I don't know if I could have received such a good education. Documentation. Fatma is only worried about her documents. The family are currently renewing their temporary asylum papers, and if they are not accepted, she knows without documents she will lose her job. Fatma's recommendation to the Russian authorities are to allow people to work. She said that all refugees who arrive here, wherever they come from, did not just come here to observe. They fled some kind of danger, threat to life, persecution. They all need help. I wish they would be given some kind of work, some kind of documents until the situation in their countries calms down, so they can live here freely without hiding from the police. They have small children too that they need to feed and clothe, so I only have one recommendation. Let us refugees find work. Thank you for your attention.
If we move on to the situation in Ukraine, as of the 1st of January this year, there were almost 2,500 recognised refugees in Ukraine, and again, one of the major groups are refugees from Afghanistan. Afghan refugees and asylum seekers in Ukraine face problems similar to those to other nationalities, namely racism, xenophobia, lack of integration prospects, and sometimes even a lack of protection. Asylum claims are not always thoroughly assessed by the Ukrainian officials, which mean they get no protection in Ukraine, as according to the Ukrainian government, the human rights situation in Afghanistan has significantly improved recently. Furthermore, Afghan asylum seekers do not always have access to interpretation or legal aid. There's no reliable age assessment procedures, and authorities consider teenagers as adults. As children, they will not be held in detention and will be provided with guardianship to ensure their best interests were taken into account at all stages of the procedure. Afghan asylum seekers can also be threatened by removal, which was the case in 2011 when a whole group of asylum seekers were expelled from the country and when they tried to apply for asylum, and they alleged that they were badly treated in detention. The government of Ukraine provides no financial benefits at all for asylum seekers. They are able to request free accommodation in state-run facilities, but places are very limited. Asylum seekers usually depend on social and legal services provided by NGOs and UNHCR, whose budgets are very limited. If you get refugee status in Ukraine, the government provides you with a one-off grant of 17 hryvnias, which is less than $3. Once they have refugee status, refugees do have access to welfare payments on an equal footing with Ukrainian citizens, although this is very limited. Afghans at times are subject to police harassment, arbitrary detention and extortion in Ukraine. The risk is higher for those working on markets, which is basically one of the only avenues for income for refugees from Afghanistan. There's a lack of employment and state-run integration programs, which means that integration prospects are very limited, and usually only those married to Ukrainian people stay in the country. Many try to relocate to the EU. The level of racist attacks is quite high in Ukraine, and therefore the majority of people who look different suffer from discrimination. There are several refugee communities in different regions who try to help their Afghan compatriots with employment opportunities and assistance in emergency situations. Khurasan in Kharkiv is one organisation, and this is their assessment of the situation for Afghan women in Ukraine. Ukraine is modern and civilised, therefore Afghan women can live in a more democratic way here. They can be active in social life and defend their rights, but unfortunately, due to a lack of language as well as support from the family, women mostly end up being at home taking care of their children. Some girls, women, are deprived of education because they do not have sufficient financial resources. Some other girls, unfortunately, are not permitted to attend university by their parents due to cultural differences. Some women are not permitted by their husbands to attend national ceremonies or local integration programmes, which is funded by the European Commission and UNHCR. Due to difficult living conditions, financial obstacles and a lack of documentation for asylum seekers, an intolerant attitude by local people, many women suffer from psychological and health problems. Currently, asylum-seeking women are deprived of medical assistance free of charge. A number of women and girls are being held in detention centres because of attempts to illegally cross the border, and detention can last up to 1 year. Some girls and women with families can be deported at the border and do not have access to asylum. Khurasan does run language courses for women and children and organises cultural celebrations in some ways the same way as the organisations in the UK, although their resources are very limited. And they also are quite active in advocacy and lobbying, working together with the international organisations as much as possible. We have one short case study from Ukraine, and then we'll be inviting Shabnam to tell us about the UK. So that's all from me, I think.
This is Mila's story. Mila and her family were in Russia when in 1993 the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan. Her father could not return due to his political opinion. He was a member of the Communist Party. In Afghanistan, he lectured at the Kabul University and worked in the Ministry of Education. Since 1982, he studied for a PhD in Russia. Soon they moved to Ukraine, applied for a refugee status, which they received only in 2002. In 1993, when they applied for refugee status in Ukraine, the migration authorities were being reformed. The migration department changed 14 times, and Nila's family did not know what to do and who to talk to. They had to bribe the authorities and get their visas extended, and it was very difficult and expensive for her family. Nila came to Ukraine at the age of 7. She went to school in Ukraine, then graduated from university, got a job, and says she did not experience major problems apart from routine ones. Her father needed to provide for his family, and the salary he was offered at the university was not enough to rent an apartment and buy food and clothes. To this day, he works on the market, Barabashville, and this work is physically very demanding, as he needs to sell goods outside, even when the temperatures fall to -40 degrees Celsius. It was difficult to find an apartment to rent in Ukraine, because nobody wanted to rent out an apartment to the family with 4 children. The family had to say that they had only 2 children. and keep the other two hidden from the landlord. Even now, it's very difficult for a foreigner to find accommodation, and the state does not provide refugees with accommodation. At the moment, Nila works for an NGO that protects human rights of the Ukrainian migrants. She says she never had problems with professors or students while studying. The only problem was that the local authorities did not understand who refugees were and did not know much about refugee documents. Nila claimed that she never had problems with the police, but her mother and her brother were detained many times. Usually people had to pay a certain amount of money to policemen in order to avoid detention. The future is here. Nila's family sees their future as being in Ukraine, as they've lived here for 15 years. They plan to apply for Ukrainian citizenship. Though life in Ukraine is becoming more expensive and it is difficult to live without proper accommodation and state support. The citizenship procedure is very bureaucratic, and the state authorities require a lot of documents, as well as requiring applicants to pass the Ukrainian language exam. Nila speaks Ukrainian as she studied in Ukraine. She thinks, though, that it must be very difficult for other foreigners to pass the exam, and there are no state Ukrainian language courses. Increasing fear. These are some examples of xenophobic and racist attacks which started in Ukraine about a year ago. People claim that if you walk down the main street in Kharkiv, Samska Street, you will see that a lot of walls are painted with swastikas. Every old lady tells you that you are black and you need to go back to your home country, feeling at home. Despite all the problems, Nila thinks that her family is nearly integrated into the Ukrainian society. However, the integration for her is to feel internal comfort and equality, which is not always maintained. She thinks that the Ukrainian society is not ready to host foreigners, as only a small percentage of the Ukrainian population understands what migration is and who refugees are. Nila's recommendation to the Ukrainian authority is, please study your own laws. She thinks that there should be a state integration program for refugees in Ukraine, which does not exist at the moment. After the interview was recorded, Nila was selected to attend a seminar, Being a Young Refugee, organized by the Council of Europe in France. However, she was refused a Schengen visa as the French embassy thought she was planning not to return to Ukraine. Another reason was that EU member states do not always recognize refugee travel documents issued by Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.